Well, thanks, Gardner, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Because CO2 Deep Store may not be known to some of you involved in the oil and gas industry, it's a very brief introduction to the company. Founded in Aberdeen 4 years ago by four of us who came out of the oil and gas industry, basic objective to be an operator of carbon stores. It sounded simple at the time. Boy, did we learn a lot. One of the things you really need is a very big balance sheet behind you, because the nature of the projects and the unpredictability of the revenue stream means that you just need deep pockets. Right now, we're effectively a business development unit within Petrofac, but with some strong ambitions to be developing carbon stores. The proposition today, and proposition that I think is very attractive to a lot of people, is the proposition that somehow CCS will either enable or facilitate EOR. And it's a very attractive proposition for several reasons. It, as both Jim and John have alluded to, is very common in the US. It involves large oil company balance sheets, so the sorts of monies that Jim Lawsong's just been talking about don't actually freak people out. It engages the technical know-how of the oil and gas companies and the associated industry, particularly the subsurface, but wells, facilities and so on. And it also minimises, if you can do it effectively, some of the interesting challenges that arise if you're trying to transition a reservoir and infrastructure between the original oil and gas purpose and this new purpose, which might be CCS. And if you can make it so it's attractive to the current owners of that infrastructure, you're more likely to get an interested hearing. My general experience is that most oil companies don't regard straight CCS as a potential business stream for them. But the result of all of these good pluses is what you've heard a bit of today, and what is very commonly held perception, that globally governments, academics, industry watchers expect EOR to be involved in CCS in some very strong way. And of course, you can point, as John did, across the Atlantic and say, it's happening there, should clearly work. What I would want to emphasise before I start splashing cold water around is that I'm very clear that EOR does work. It's a well-established process. In the US, they ship the better part of 50 million tonnes of CO2 a year. And that's sort of in the realms of the sort of numbers that Jim was talking about. You remember his neat little bit of economics assumed the small detail of 80 million tonnes of CO2 being available. In the US, they reckon that something like 5% of their current production is EOR supported, and that works out at somewhere around 350,000, 400,000 barrels a day. And it would suggest that they've got something like 240 billion barrels of reserves that might be accessible with CO2. But it also, a crucial point, it needs the CO2. And this graphic on the right, it shows the supply. And as John Glias pointed out, it comes from a natural source. We produce perfectly well sequestered and stored CO2 out the ground, ship it a couple of thousand miles, and pump it into the ground to produce the EOR. So that supply is probably the key point that I want to address. Well, we've kind of gone rather faster than I expected here. So, in terms of supply, we need a lot of it. You need order of magnitude millions of tonnes to be able to do a CCS project. And that's the problem. The entire European market for CO2 at the moment, for things like fizzy drinks and fire extinguishers, is 1 million tonnes a year. So there's a big issue about where it comes from, and the only viable sources are the big emitters, power stations, cement works, steel works, that sort of thing. That's where you get a lot of CO2 in one place. But even one project, you might be looking at 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 million tonnes a year from one particular source. And the take profile of EOR isn't very helpful. Whereas the power station will be producing CO2 pretty constantly for 30 or 40 years, your CO2 in EOR goes round. You take it out with the oil, that's the point, it's an immiscible process. So you don't need new CO2, perhaps in year 5 or year 8. So the supply profile is the purple one, the demand profile starts to tail off. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the requirement of the supplier and the requirement of the EOR organisation. The other big issue is simply the costs, and I'm pretty much going to duplicate what Jim said, but if you are looking at a new build power station, you're looking at investment of the thick end of £1.5 billion. You've got huge consent hurdles. Most people don't want it in their backyard, and an awful lot of very noisy people don't want coal as a source of our power, even though they'd kind of like the lights to stay on. So there are big consenting hurdles. The electricity market, which is how the power company makes its money in the UK is like a deck of cards all up in the air at the moment. The government has said it's going to change it. It's in the process of changing it, but it hasn't finished changing it. And then you've got electricity demand. It's very spiky. Between a low at night and a peak in the day, there's a factor of 2 difference. So some power stations need to be able to switch off. And that flexibility brings additional challenges. So the actual building of a power station is a challenge. Whether it's on a new station or an old station, you've then got to capture the CO2. A coal station might put 12 or 14% of its flue gas is CO2. The rest is nitrogen, miscellaneous other nasties. But capturing it is a big chemical plant. For the sort of demo projects that are being considered at the moment, you're looking at, around numbers, £500 million of investment on an amine plant. Yes, we can do it, but it's still a big piece of kit to stick on the side of a power station. And of course, power stations tend to be on land, so we end up with a fairly hefty pipeline and very round numbers. If you sort of think about £1 million a kilometre, you're not going to be far off. Some pipelines significantly more expensive if they've got to be bigger or they're going round things. So £500 million to £1 billion for a pipeline. And then there's the investment in the brownfield. And okay, Jim said £1.5 billion. I'm not going to argue. It's a lot of money to build the facilities. If it's a brownfield, you've got to modify to cope with the acid that the CO2 will produce because it's been through the reservoir, picked up some moisture. Crucial thing here is who's doing that investment. The oil company very clearly has the interest in the offshore end. They might be able to bite off doing the pipe, but that sort of suddenly takes their investment up to a whole lot. But the chance of an oil company even being allowed to invest on the capture plant on somebody's power station is pretty remote. So you need a number of organisations to make very substantial capital investment decisions all at about the same time. So a very significant challenge. So that major investment at the power station, the capture and transport may well become a new service provider. Certainly, very publicly, National Grid are working to develop a transportation infrastructure to support CCS. The platform and well investment, clearly somebody else. So I guess our view is it needs a hell of a lot of planets to line up to make such a project actually happen so that you can get EOR going, because you need all of these big bits of investment, these big bits of the project to work before you're actually able to do EOR. So the conclusion that CO2 deep store very firmly has is that rather than leading CCS, EOR is likely to follow it. CCS with storage, so not doing EOR, is likely to be the thing that it's simpler to get your head around, still complicated, but it's simpler, and it gets the production of CO2 at a scale that's appropriate for EOR actually happening. Then EOR can follow, because now that one of those big risk factors in the 3-step value chain for EOR has been addressed. We've now got a supply of CO2 that we might actually be able to use. Hence the comment about the chicken and the egg. So that's my sort of conclusion of spreading a bit of cold water around. I think it'll happen just a bit later. Thank you.